Don Quixote, originally published in 1605, is a book that almost anybody will recognize from its most famous windmill scene. However, setting out to read it myself, I realized I had no idea what it was actually about, or that it was even a comedy. Although there's a fantastic amount of content to be found in the pages, a powerful and recurring connection I found was in the parallels to the modern pastime of Dungeons & Dragons, or tabletop RPGs more generally. Miguel de Cervantes' work is so anticipatory to the overall experience of D&D that's almost as if he peered 400 years into the future and wrote Don Quixote as a parody of us, gathered around a kitchen table. In this video, I will make a series of comparisons to illustrate this. My objective is to encourage you to read this book and enjoy it. Just the first 8 chapters will give you a sense of the work and allow you to comprehend this video better. I won't spoil anything major, but if you don't know what the book is like, my monologue will likely enact an undue influence on your interpretation. Really, the comparisons come so immediately, I think that reading a few chapters will nullify the need for you to watch this video at all. I recommend the translation by Edith Grossman, which is recent and more easily read than past translations. First, I'll start with some large-scale, meta-level comparisons about the context of playing the game. The premise of Don Quixote is that a man who constantly reads chivalric romances, which you can think of as similar to low fantasy novels, becomes so enamored with them that his bearing in reality comes apart. Perceiving the world to be the one from his romances that is populated with castles, knights, and princesses, and needing saving from malicious sorcerers and enormous giants, he sets off on a journey, broken up into episodic encounters, the chronicle of which becomes the novel. Players of D&D can usually attest to a similar origin story. Though we are hopefully grounded in reality, one major attraction of the game is our exposure to fantasy stories of tribulations and heroics, worlds that can be explored and where we can make a difference. Instead of interacting with this fantasy world believing it to be true, as Don Quixote does, we let imagination delude us and conjure a fantastical world to engage with. Now, having decided to play D&D, what's the first thing to do before starting? Character creation. This is one of the major revelations that reading Don Quixote will give you. He wasn't always Don Quixote. He quite literally invents and adopts a character created by himself in the first chapter of the novel. He doesn't roll his stats, but he readies everything else a DM would expect to. He gives himself a new name, befitting of a chivalric knight. We can perhaps relate to the fact that it takes him 8 days to come up with one. He paints his armor and invents a backstory and a motivation. That is, winning the love of the beautiful Dulcinea del Toboso, really a peasant girl from another village. One subtlety that I think is fascinating is that even though Don Quixote's mind is said to be lost, he still references his genuine past and identity. The name Quixote is derived from the protagonist's family name, Quijada. He also adopts the title of La Mancha, reflecting his real birthplace, an arid plateau in central Spain, humorously having nothing to do with any chivalric romances. His love interest is an infatuated recollection of an old crush, and, for his horse, he finally decided to call the horse Rocinante, a name, in his opinion, that was noble, sonorous, and reflective of what it had been when it was a nag. Even though most RPGs take place on a completely alternative reality with its own history and culture and where the players never existed, and even though it would be most accurate to invent completely original characters abiding by this alien setting, like Don Quixote, we inevitably put aspects of our own personalities, histories, and experiences into our characters. One more observation on the meta level. Even though Cervantes targets chivalric romances for satire, he undoubtedly has an admiration for them. It takes a great knowledge of the characters and encounters to accurately portray a character who is supposed to be utterly immersed in that world. In the book, even though these romances are antiquated, they are still a powerful cultural force, and many of those that Don Quixote encounter have themselves read the same stories. In Don Quixote's first encounter, he goes to an inn which he perceives to be a castle, looking to be knighted so he may properly begin his adventure. The innkeeper, detecting him as a potential cause for trouble, and comprehending the source of his delusions, assumes the character of the lord of the castle to be comprehensible to Don Quixote. Indeed, anybody who tries to reason with Don Quixote finds that he can always subsume reality with fiction. Confronted with an alternative reality, the innkeeper himself has to roleplay just to interact with Don Quixote. Next, I'll quickly cover some points where the adventures of Don Quixote are comparable to the gameplay experience of D&D. These points will be briefer and much less intricate than the ones above. First, just like most role-playing parties, it's funny that Don Quixote runs around drawing the ire of basically everybody he encounters. When we play tabletop RPGs, most NPCs we run into seem foolish because they don't have the luxury of knowing that they don't exist. That is to say, if they are being played by the DM realistically, decisions carry life and death consequences for them, but not the players, so the players can do outlandish things. Similarly, Don Quixote fully antagonizes people who don't see evil enemies in all directions and are just interested in defending themselves. Second, the influence of adventurers on themselves. In the second part of Don Quixote, the people in the story have already read part 1 and interact with Don Quixote differently, knowing about him. This can be likened to when a party gains experience and notoriety and has to consider their reputation as they run into people to whom their news has traveled faster than their persons. Or perhaps you can compare it to the role of the dungeon master, constantly laying out the story just past the player's field of view, and rebalancing it according to past events and expectations instead of all at once in the onset. On the topic of the role of the DM, a common explanation for Don Quixote for when he's about to be forced to confront reality is that a sorcerer cast an illusion upon him and dispelled it after he tries unsuccessfully to combat a foe that doesn't really exist. This belief in a mystical force arranging the parameters of a quest is, of course, equivalent to the role of the dungeon master, who calls upon their originality and knowledge of famous stories to conjure obstacles and confound the players. To conclude, I first covered some meta-level aspects of Don Quixote that relate to D&D and other tabletop RPGs, and then I showed how the adventures in the two have some similarities. I encourage you to pick up Don Quixote and give it a read, as it is quite entertaining and you will most likely find humor in having yourself be made fun of by the clever Miguel de Cervantes. This is not meant to deter you from using your imagination or playing D&D. If anything, one thing we can admire in Don Quixote is his resoluteness of spirit and determination to experience the lifestyle that he admires. As a final similarity, perhaps we should be a bit more wayward ourselves and pursue exciting adventures, whether real or imagined. Thank you.